Today, I want to discuss something which I think is of a very pressing concern, something of a very uh, significant importance. And that thing is, do we need philosophy, or whether there is any need for philosophy in our so-called scientifically and technologically advanced world, and in particular, West? This is a question that in previous epochs or eras would have been somewhat incomprehensible, because they wouldn't have thought that philosophical thinking or questions which are philosophical would actually ever come to a halt. But in our present day, in fact, for at least more than a century or so, there has been a trend in our culture which believes that philosophical endeavor is a fruitless endeavor, that it is something which is either useless or it is something which has been rendered useless by our progress in science. So when you read physicists, very renowned physicists like Stephen Hawking and many others, they tend to think, not those physicists who are probably cultivated uh, in in philosophy. So someone like Steven Weinberg would not make uh, a judgment or a claim like philosophy is useless, or that it is dead. But someone like Stephen Hawking, who is one of the greatest physicists of our times, actually wrote in one of his books that philosophy is actually dead. And here I want to distinguish and what philosophy actually is and how it differs from science. Look, there are two questions that all rational, self-reflecting human beings ask: the how questions and the why and what questions. How questions are related to how things work in the universe, for example. So if you fall an apple, if you drop an apple, it falls down. That is a physical phenomenon that you're observing, right? And you can ask the question why it falls down, but here the why implies a scientific answer, because it's connected to understanding the mechanism that results in this in the dropping of the falling of the apple, right? So you can work out a theory, you can create a law, and you can examine and understand this. This is related to understanding our empirical physical phenomenon. Same goes for the entirety of the physical reality, which includes the entirety of our universe. But there are questions which are the WH questions. These are the questions which are related to whys and what. So for example, the questions, why am I here? Why do I exist? This is a different sort of question from how questions. Here you're not asking, how do I exist? Well, I exist because of reproduction, because of reproduction and cycle and so on, right? We could describe a mechanism of how people are produced, a biological mechanism. But the question that I'm asking is not how do I exist, but why do I exist? Why do I have to exist? I could have not existed, presumably, but I do exist. This is a question which has a philosophical tilt. It is more of a philosophical or existential question. It relates to our existence. And in more, perhaps on a wider scale, we could ask the question why anything exists at all. Anything at all. which includes any physical reality, even an atom, perhaps. When we ask these kinds of questions, we are asking philosophical questions. And science can never address these questions because these are not related to understanding the composition, the operation, the mechanism, the laws which govern the physical reality. This is an entirely different sort of questions. A much more important and perhaps more pertinent question might be, uh, how do we treat human beings? How, as human beings, we ought to treat one another and look upon one another. Now, science alone can never answer these questions. These are questions which require from us philosophical contemplation. And very often I have seen, because some scientists are not educated in philosophy, they tend to confuse philosophical questions with with scientific questions, and they tend to treat as if they are synonymous, or as if their science can actually answer those questions. So a very important question: why is there anything rather than nothing? Why something exists rather than nothing? Some scientists, such as physicists, such as Lawrence Krauss and others, they believe the science has an answer for that. And how do they answer it? They conceive of nothingness as merely one physical state amongst the others. And then they try to explain through physics how, let's say, having very few, having a quantum form perhaps, or simply the law of gravity, these can create a sort of physical reality or the universe that we find ourselves in. Now, notice that when a physicist is addressing the question, why is there something rather than nothing, he's always beginning with some set of laws or either with some form of physical state which may be devoid of substance, but he's starting with a physical state. And he's defining how one physical state can lead to a more sophisticated form of physical state. But he's starting from within the paradigm of a physical state. But when a philosopher asks this question, he asks the question about the very possibility of any existence whatsoever, including all the laws of physics and all the quantum states. So when you don't understand philosophical thinking, you begin to think as if science has an answer to questions which are properly philosophical. And the same happens in the realm of morality. Now, he's not a scientist, and he's fairly simplistic in many of his writings, but someone who's had a profound influence on certain sections of our society. Someone like Sam Harris, for example, who wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, and we try to describe how science can actually answer moral questions. And he started off with this supposition that morality is essentially about well-being, or well, in his definition of well-being implied reducing human suffering and increasing human flourishing. But here he's starting with a supposition which cannot be in any way justified through science. Science cannot answer the question why well-being is good, why human suffering should be minimized. From a purely scientific point of view, you cannot even say that Nazis who built the concentration camps or who exterminated the Jews, or the people who worked at Auschwitz concentration camp were doing anything morally objectionable, because science is a morally neutral realm of affairs. It doesn't deal with moral questions. It deals with is questions, as Hume pointed out. It deals with descriptive facts about the universe, but it has nothing to say about ought questions. How it can define how the world is, but not how the world should be. These are two different questions. And Harris doesn't address the is and ought distinction. Perhaps it is not very important for him, if I recall correctly. So there is a huge misconception in our culture which says that philosophy has passed its prime or that it's not required anymore. But philosophy can never pass its prime, can never become totally irrelevant. It can do so for maybe a century or so, but that's because we are already living within a philosophical framework. We have not yet arrived at an occasion when we seriously have to challenge that framework and come up with something new. So all our modern ideas, all our cherished assumptions about human dignity, human rights, about equality, about democracy, about transparency, about accountability, about justice, these are all grounded not in science, but in firmly philosophical assumptions. And this is why philosophy is absolutely imperative. So today we have this idea that we have gone to the Mars, we are trying to colonize Mars. Technology has, eased our lives in many ways, which it has. Why do we need philosophy? And this question needs to be addressed because we need philosophy to think about more profound questions. And those profound questions, they keep on coming, they keep on renewing themselves every time. So it's a very famous assertion from a Polish philosopher, Leszek Kołakowski, who says that philosophy does not supply the answers as much as it builds the spirit of truth and builds a spirit for questioning. And in philosophy, every new answer becomes a new question. So philosophy is a never-ending um, enterprise. It is because it deals with ideas which are abstract, which are not necessarily grounded in some empirical facts about the nature, but they are more profound, they are more relevant to us than scientific questions. In fact, we don't quite often realize that when we speak of science, we are actually doing philosophy. For example, if a scientist makes this assertion that all knowledge is essentially scientific, or that everything, a science has an answer for every question, he's not doing science, because there's no way to reach to this conclusion through any empirical ways. You cannot use any scientific demonstration to come up with this idea that all knowledge is essentially reducible to what science can address. You are actually making an epistemological and philosophical judgment, but you just don't realize because we are too saturated by philosophical thinking in a way that we don't even realize what sort of statements we are making. So the point being that even those who are contemptuous towards philosophy, even they are doing some kind of philosophy. And it is so widespread in our culture. I mean, most of us are by default subscribe to some form of scientism, or as it was usually called in the past, positivism, which says that science is the only way to attain knowledge, or that all possible knowledge can be reduced merely to scientific knowledge, which is quite an incoherent position to take, because not only it can not be proven through science, but that much of even science is predicated on certain assumptions which you cannot ever reach through scientific means, such as the very existence of mathematical and logical truths. There's no way that you can demonstrate them through scientific means. And obviously, the very assumption that the universe that we are investigating is obviously rational, that it is endowed with intelligence, and that the reality, the external reality, is real, that there is an external reality that exists. We don't realize that it's actually a philosophical assumption, and a naturalist who doesn't like, or a committed scientistic, not a scientist, but a committed scientistic, which is to say someone who subscribes to scientism, would most likely assert that this assumption is foolish, it's just self-evident, but it actually isn't. I mean, the very fact that we know that the external reality exists, we are actually relying not on science, but on our immediate experience of that reality. We're relying on our mental perceptions. That's not a scientific thing. In fact, this is the thing, even science wouldn't function if there weren't a prior set of philosophical um, articulations, if there are philosophical grounds. In fact, it is philosophy which has made actually science possible. So at the end of the day, the bottom line being science is absolutely necessary, but philosophy is equally imperative, if not more. And any human culture which actually doesn't have the quest for philosophical learning would soon extinguish itself because it wouldn't have the ability to self-question, it wouldn't have the ability to reanalyze itself, and it wouldn't have the ability to ask questions which are far more profound and which keeps the culture alive.